morning. Grab a seat, please. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Campion. I am a member of the Neighbor to Neighbor Board, and I have the responsibility to be connected with the Midtown Precinct area of Neighbor to Neighbor. I'm also on the Belmont Hillsborough Neighbors Steering Committee. I'm their treasurer, so I'm an involved neighborhood guy. This person standing here right here is J.S. Bolton, and she's going to moderate the session. J.S. lives in the Nations, and she's a mover and shaker on their leadership team, and she's been involved with them for a long time on their neighborhood association as a board member and president. She has been advocating sidewalks for quite a while. She is also the Vice President of Community Service Partnerships for the Junior League, and she's also a Neighbor Board member like myself, covering the West Precinct. This session is more than pouring concrete, addressing the issues and challenges of sidewalks. There's 4,700 miles of sidewalks missing, and pedestrian dangers skyrocket, and only 4 miles are being built a year. There's no secret that lack of sidewalks is a constant complaint from residents. We don't want complaints, we want discussions. So we've invited key leadership to be with us today, and our sponsor of this program is NDOT. So we have everybody here that we need. JS, take it away.
Thanks. So I know probably some of you, if you're interested in sidewalks, we're just at the last session on infrastructure. And I'll say a few things. I was there as well because I didn't want us to repeat ourselves. But I also like that this is a smaller group and we're taking on a smaller, more granular issue so we can really get into it and talk specifically about sidewalks. When Jim Hawk and Neighbor to Neighbor put out this survey for this year's conference, one of the questions he asked is, what is a big deal in your neighborhood? What are people talking about? What are they worried about? And sidewalks is one of the top answers people gave to that survey. And so therefore, a very focused session on what might seem to some like a small issue is actually a very big issue in a lot of neighborhoods. It certainly is in mine. If you've been to the Nations, you know we're sort of the capital of sidewalks to nowhere. There'll be a sidewalk in front of one house, then skip a house, and a sidewalk in front of the next. So it's an issue I'm certainly personally very passionate about. The format, I don't really like standing at a podium. I was hoping this would be a little bit more informal, but I'm going to spend a few minutes with each of our panelists introducing themselves. I have a few prepared questions that I think will hit some of the high points in terms of sidewalks, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. So if you're thinking about things or something you're burning to ask, there will definitely be the opportunity to do that. So with that, I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I hope you'll find we have a good mix of sort of elected representatives, legislators, advocates from the nonprofit community, and then doers from the Nashville Department of Transportation. So whatever order you guys want, but use the mic because the session is being recorded. Maybe tell the group a little bit about yourself and your involvement with sidewalks in Nashville-Davidson County.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Wesley Smith. I'm the Policy and Government Relations Manager with Walk Bike Nashville. I recently moved back to Nashville, but I grew up on the west side in a part of town where there are no sidewalks, and the only way to get anywhere is to drive. I now live in Midtown, where I can walk to pretty much anything that I want to. So I've experienced kind of both extremes, I would say, of connectivity, of our walking infrastructure. I also work very closely through Walk Bike with our Families for Safe Streets chapter here locally, and dealing with pedestrian fatalities, and often we're dealing with those on our high-speed corridors where there are not sidewalks, and also it's the greatest challenge to build sidewalks there because of the length of some of those proposed projects. And so I say that to say I'm pretty new to the nuts and bolts of sidewalk policy, but very passionate about it and excited to learn both from the panelists and from all of you once we get into the Q&A this morning.
Thank you. Good to see everybody here today to talk about sidewalks, which is one of my favorite topics. I am Councilwoman Angie Henderson. I serve Southwest Nashville, District 34 at present. I ran for office to deliver sidewalk policy. I'm a native Nashvilleian. I'm a longtime volunteer for Walk Bike Nashville. And I volunteered with a group called the Green Hills Action Partners that was working to implement an urban village plan for Green Hills. So it's a citizens advisory committee. It put together an urban village plan in partnership with planning, and one of the main things it called for in that suburban business district was walkability, connectivity. And I was often kind of standing in the breach between real estate development and the community and saying, hey, could you build a sidewalk here? No, actually, it'll be important. It'll need to connect. Would you do it, please? And I came to realize, like, oh, wait a minute, this is backwards. We need to require the sidewalk. And so when I was running for office, you saw at the time a lot of specific plan development, and that was often used honestly just to trigger the sidewalks, to get some sidewalks. So I ran for office on a Safe Streets platform to deliver a sidewalk policy to elevate and expand our requirements, both for multifamily and commercial development, but also for single and two-family development, which was a first. So this city really had kicked the can for about 80 years on sidewalk requirements. And I think, the longer we went, the further behind we were. It was just so daunting. And so I really do enjoy the policy work. Davidson County is a very difficult city to do policy for. We are 526 square miles, all kinds of different contexts, midtown, suburban, all of that. So policy making here is quite a challenge, but with intention, I think Metro Council has shown that we can elevate those requirements because we are so far behind as a city, we can't just rely on the capital budget to catch up. We've got to require sidewalks through development. So that's what I'm excited about talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Marty Sewell. I'm the Transportation Planning Director at NDOT, and we are responsible for long-range planning. That includes walk and bike, Vision Zero action plan that we produced in the last couple of years. I've been working in planning for the last around 25 years or so. I started here in Nashville back in 2000 or 1999, somewhere around there. Spent about 4 years here working at the planning department, and I spent the next 12 years in Atlanta, and then came back here in 2016 to come to a city that I thought I knew that changed quite a bit, as you all know. But let's see, I've lived in Nashville a total of 11 years now, and 2 with NDOT as we've become an organization over the last 2 years, and before that with the planning department, again, working on long-range planning. Let's see, what else do I want to mention here? We are also supporting the development review in our group as new development comes in. We're helping to make sure that walk and bike and other plans that we have are being implemented in that way, making sure that they're matching what we have, what the communities have asked for in their planning. And I guess that's all I'm going to mention, other than just, I grew up in a small town in Mississippi. My dad was a minister, and we used to walk everywhere in this little town of about 700 people. And when I went to graduate school in Memphis, one of the first things I realized, living in this midtown area of Memphis, is very urban, was how similar the small little Delta town that I lived in was to that neighborhood. And it was because of the walkability, and because I could walk to school or walk to the market, my mom could send me. So it was very similar, and I was always amazed by that. And that really helped guide me in the planning school and what I wanted to do with the rest of my career. So just wanted to share that. And again, I live in Old Hickory Village neighborhood here in Davidson County, so also another walkable neighborhood in our suburban areas, one of the few older historic neighborhoods out that way. But really enjoyed living in Nashville and look forward to this conversation.
Hi, my name is Paul I'm with the NDOT Sidewalk, mostly engineering construction program, and I'm kind of new to this position and new to Nashville, and I live in Donaldson Pike, and I'm very honored and humbled to be here. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Angie, Wesley, Marty, and Bala. So everybody wants sidewalks. Let me ask the audience. All of you, in your neighborhoods, could you raise your hand if there's places you would like to have a sidewalk and don't have one currently? People without your hands up, what neighborhood do you live in? So everyone wants sidewalks, but obviously there's limited funding available, whether you do it through capital budget or you do it through development, which means we have to have priorities. And there's a lot of different priorities that people throw out there. Proximity to schools, proximity to parks, size of the road, level of traffic. There's, probably I've seen maybe 20 to 30 different things. People say, well, this should be how we prioritize it. So I'd like to ask our panelists, how do you think we should be prioritizing using limited funds to build sidewalks in Nashville? And whichever one of you wants to go first, please go ahead. Go for it.
I can start on that. Again, looking at how, and I'll talk about it in terms of how we managed it at NDOT with the walk and bike plan. And primarily that was, there are a lot of different ways, like you said, that you could think through where a sidewalk should be. But one of the things we focused on was the population, of the type of population versus the destination, or in other words, where the vulnerable populations live, whether that's, well, just a wide variety of factors. Safety, connectivity, access to transit, and health and equity, and the idea of just being able to center vulnerability, vulnerable populations, and make sure that we are providing safe access to transit in places that they can go. So that's one of the key things. And I had another note here that I meant to mention with this question, but it appears to escape me. But just the idea that we want to, all of these things kind of work together. And so whether you're looking at it straight from, it should go on corridors or it should go on next to schools, a lot of that is taken care of when you start thinking of where the crashes have occurred and where the lack of connectivity is, and it starts to fill in. So I'll just start with that. Councilmember Randolph.
I think when you are working backwards, right? You do have to set those priorities, and I think because I serve a largely suburban area without walkable infrastructure, there is a lot of understandable frustration in that area. And it's a difficult conversation to have sometimes about why we need to put capital investment in areas that are more dense, effectively optimizing that investment. Because in a suburban context, if you have, one house per half acre, or in my district, sometimes per acre, that's a lot of high cost to serve fewer people. It's not that your city council doesn't care about all those people, but it is really just a mathematical equation. It's being good stewards of your tax dollars. And so Marty was speaking to, there's density of that population, and just numbers, vulnerability of that population. So sometimes around our apartment communities, you might have a one vehicle household, a no vehicle household, transit proximity. Do you have a fairly dense neighborhood that is also near to transit, but also a park? I mean, just all these things sort of factoring in to kind of bump up that capital investment. So it is very intentional. I will say sometimes I feel like I've sort of lost the through line on all the factors, because when my colleagues and I came into office in 2015, the city did a lot of strategic planning. So we had the walk and bike strategic plan. I served as chair of the subcommittee of the policy subcommittee, policy and enforcement subcommittee. A lot of good community engagement around sidewalks. Came up in the infrastructure panel. I, with Walk Bike Nashville, in 2014, hosted the first mayoral forum. It was solely on the topic of walkability. The moment had really arrived for the city. We were getting folks moving here from other cities who had certain expectations about how it should be walkable. And I really did feel a tipping point as a native Nashvilleian advocating for sidewalks, and people are like, sidewalks, who needs those? You could drive everywhere, right? And so there really was a wave at that time in the administration and folks coming into office in 2015. And so we did a lot of, we did the Plan to Play master plan, the walk and bike strategic plan. That walk and bike plan has been updated. That was updated during the pandemic. All due respect, I don't feel like maybe there was sufficient council engagement and so forth. So I think there's been a little disconnect in the community about kind of what are the priorities and how they get prioritized and how we communicate that. We've had 3 mayors in a time, we normally have 1. We've had lots of different directors at NDOT. Like, there's just been a lot going on. So I do think in the community education space, we do need to kind of get back to, please do know that capital investments are prioritized very intentionally. But I think it can be difficult, whether for those of us as council members or community members, to articulate why we built here, but why we didn't build there, and kind of how we set those priorities.
So, I have 2 things. One's kind of a framing thing and a roundabout way of getting to your question, JS. But I think the history that Councilmember Henderson so rightly pointed out of how we've built since World War II, very suburban, sprawling, right? Yes, we're having infill development, but we're continuing to build and build sprawl, right? And so while it's a great thing that we're requiring sidewalks in all new developments, the utility of a sidewalk at the edge of Davidson County, like a mile of sidewalk, doesn't go as far as a mile of sidewalk in the nations, for example. So we have to, I think, also think about how sidewalk and infrastructure in general intersects with land use planning. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I do a lot of work specifically on Dickerson Pike because of the dangers for pedestrians. There is, I think, a $15 million project coming down the pipe for about a mile of sidewalk on Dickerson Pike, and that would be huge. But I think we also need to think about, especially on our corridors, these long stretches of road where pedestrians are, when we restripe that road, when we reconfigure that space, can we have shared use paths, right, where we have a safe walking path that's not necessarily a sidewalk, that's significantly cheaper than building sidewalks, and we could get done a lot quicker, right? So when it comes to priorities, that's something I think of because I want us to have sidewalks where there are pedestrian generators, but there are also folks walking on these corridors where the safety is a much different context than walking in a neighborhood. So those are some just framing things and also some of the challenges I think in prioritizing.
Thanks, guys. So I think both Angie and Leslie talked about cost. $15 million for 1 mile. Sidewalks are, at least to me, shockingly expensive, both money-wise and time it takes-wise. I don't know if any of you have seen several years ago, I guess NDOT's predecessor organizations had put together a detailed PowerPoint on what it takes to build a sidewalk. And they came to our neighborhood association and presented it, and my takeaway was it'll take 5 years and you'll get like 1 house with a sidewalk because of money and time. So I'm interested to ask our panelists about inefficiencies or opportunities to improve efficiency both financially and time-wise in how we build sidewalks in Nashville. How can we do this better? How can we not be spending $15 million for 1 sidewalk?
Okay, I can't speak to that specific $15 million sidewalk, I assume on a state route. I think, from a cost standpoint, again, kind of, both and. There's the capital investment, there's what we require through private development, and I would also say specific to our pikes, what our expectation is from the state, because those are state routes. Our most dangerous streets in our city are our state routes, and so the state is really wanting to pick on Nashville right now, but Jackson, Tennessee, every town in Tennessee, the state route is the most dangerous place to walk or be. So we do have that commonality and mutuality. So I hope we will, as citizens and cities, continue to work together and advocate for TDOT to put more into making pikes safer. So I think that is a piece that I would like to see us kind of bring up from a cost standpoint. But as to kind of the granular, what each thing costs, and I will defer to our engineer here shortly, but as I understand it, a typical sidewalk design, 70% of that is stormwater infrastructure. So if you can think in a suburban context where you typically today might have a ditch, an open ditch, you've got to channelize that, put the sidewalk over it, put in a curb, put in the stormwater inlets. So, it can look like when you drive down the road, like, oh, that's no big deal. And, it is really a trade-off from a safety and a quality of the sidewalk, the utility of the sidewalk. Nashville, for a while in the Purcell administration, had a burst of sidewalks, and you do see those around. They are typically 5 foot wide. They are right on the road. Often they are on a collector road, which as of now still has a default speed limit of 35, but maybe we're going to do something about that. But those roads, 35 miles an hour, people go 40, they do. And so only on one side, you got to turn your back to that traffic. That's a harrowing experience. And so the utility of that 5 foot sidewalk, especially if you're holding the hand of a child yourself, you're using about 3 feet of that sidewalk at best. And so that said, though, we were able to deliver JS a fair amount of sidewalks because we didn't have to acquire right-of-way, whether or not we had to engage the stormwater system, right? So we were just kind of getting stuff down where we could. And so, again, that's kind of both and. Sometimes you're going to need to do that. Maybe if you could traffic calm that street, right? So if you can make the street itself safer, having a sidewalk next to it is not necessarily a bad thing. On your pikes, Dickerson, at cost, nope. And yes, we should get the speeds down on those pikes as well, but that becomes a safety issue. So you need to have that being kind of removed from the vehicle traffic. So I think it's working backwards. It's really just working in reverse. We are retrofitting our city, and that always costs more than having required it and built it right the first time. So I will defer to engineers over here.
Can I paraphrase a little bit of what you said, that it costs a lot more to do it right, but that might slow down actually building miles of sidewalk? So trade-off, do you want it right next to the road, or do you want it done away from the road, building in with stormwater and everything else?
Yeah, just to follow up, yes, I think so. And so, for, I guess, sidewalks in more denser areas with more utility and where the transit is, we have our major and collector street plan standard that has a furnishing zone. That furnishing zone can, where you put your mailboxes and your sidewalks and your trees and so forth. But in a, maybe if you're making an important connection that's internal to a neighborhood that might connect to a park, but it's on a traffic calm street that only has a speed limit of 25, that might be an okay place to do a more narrow sidewalk along the edge. So kind of, context matters, and context and cost are related to each other, I guess I would say.
And Councilmember, I appreciate that distinction and just the, general discussion about the trade-off that you have to make whenever you look at an individual location like that. And Bala can speak to the cost of it, but just from a policy perspective, that is a conversation internally that we have to have whenever there's a need for a sidewalk today. Do we have time for redevelopment to wait a couple more years, or do we? One in particular, I'm thinking of Madison Station or Madison Square Shopping Center. We went in and we did something now because it needed to be done. We did it quickly so we could stay in the right of way and get it done. And now there's a sidewalk there, and it happened pretty quickly.
The determination it needed to be done, back to the prioritization.
What
led it to cross that threshold that it was needed to be done now?
Right, and part of it is the population in the area, the population in the street is so busy, the fatalities and the crashes, for sure, thanks, was definitely a part of it, and just the need was immediate. and not, to wait. Now, we can, place can redevelop, and we can, get more right-of-way, and we can do all sorts of things, and not that just one in particular, but other places like that. But there is the need in some instances. We just got to get it done. We have to have a place for people to walk. But it is that trade-off. It's hard as a planner. I go back to the original plans and the vision, and everybody has all these beautiful pictures, and that's what we want to do when we can. But there's also just that trade-off again of the immediate need. And so I'll hand it off to Bala. Is there anything?
Yeah, on a construction standpoint, building the sidewalk is pretty simple. You're just pouring concrete and building the sidewalk. But you have all the other variables that come about building the sidewalks. One example is purchasing right away. Sometimes we have issues with property owners that they don't want that sidewalk, so we go into condemnation and we have to go to court, and that takes like 6 to 9 months. And then another issue is stormwater. That's a big cost component because a lot of the streets and infrastructure in Nashville, a lot of them, when you're adding more concrete to it, you probably need to account for the stormwater flow and all that. So you're going to need additional piping and additional inlets and then underground work too, because if you're going to put piping, you got to dig underground, and that's going to take a lot of work, coordination with the contractor. And then sometimes, as an example, Lower Broadway, we're working on sidewalk projects, and it's really congested to work in the city, so the contractor has to make a lot of adjustments. He can open traffic, he can be working during rush hour traffic, so we have to close it down. We have to have a detour route. So once again, in summary, building the sidewalk is the easy part, but all the complexities that come around it to get to that point, that's the one that causes the inefficiencies. That might take even a year to build a sidewalk. So, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
In that same space that Bilal was mentioning, so there is right-of-way acquisition. So we looked at sidewalk costs, 70% being in stormwater, right-of-way acquisition. Metro to just come through and just whoop, condemn all the way down through there and just take it and do that. Nope, we go to each person along the way. And also utility coordination. That is a huge time sink issue because we have some state legislation that kind of reached down and said, you have to give notice, and they can have, is it 90 days to respond, 160 days, like
180.
100?
180.
Oh, 180 days to respond, right? And so, and often they don't respond to, day 179, and that's just them responding, okay? So when you're trying to coordinate a project, and the horizon on that through utility coordination, right-of-way acquisition, but the policy that we implemented for sidewalk requirements, I know folks understandably are frustrated sometimes in maybe a suburban context where there was not an abutting sidewalk on the block face and it was on a certain time, that they get a waiver. But when they don't get waived, they make a contribution in lieu of construction, and if needed, to build an MCSP, Major Collector Street Plan Standard sidewalk, if right-of-way or pedestrian easement is needed, that's a mandatory dedication. So you may not see a sidewalk there, but if it's an area that you think it's a need for the community, we're starting to bank all that, all those right-of-way pedestrian easements that we need through policy requirement, so that when Metro might come back in the future to connect this transit stop to this park and so forth, then it's going to take less time because we will have required the right-of-way. But that's the time sink, is utility coordination, right-of-way acquisition, and cost being mostly in stormwater.
So, did I hear correctly, it's 180 days for the utility coordination, or is that the people's houses?
That's the utility coordination. Yeah, and
And you said that was the state.
yeah, Mr. Freeze, our chief engineer, can probably speak to that more specifically.
So there's a law that requires us to give them that much notice and review the plans. We don't always, we really work to try to get in that, but that is kind of the threshold. Sometimes we do a lot of hand-holding, a lot of specific outreach to make sure we cut that down, but per law, they have that time to review the plans, prepare their relocations, and then say, okay, we're good, or we don't have any conflicts here. So that's That's what we're up against.
That's fascinating to me, because it seems to be like a law that is in place to make things inefficient, which is a great segue to the next question I have for the panel. So I know Councilmember Henderson just talked about the in lieu of fee and a lot of the legislation that she has passed. What's next in terms of policy and legislation, in your guys' view, from either the local or the state level? Like, what can we do from a policy perspective to make this better, make this faster, and get more sidewalks? I think I have one, which is we should get rid of this 180 days utility thing, but obviously I don't know that much about it since I just found out a few minutes ago.
Yeah, that is state policy. Often that can be a big challenge. So we passed the sidewalk bill in 2017 as a 40-member body. I had 37 co-sponsors. And then in 2019, a commitment that we made to stakeholders. If you can believe it, at the time, I worked with the Chamber of Commerce. They were our stakeholder facilitator for that legislation. We met with multifamily and commercial developers first in our first stakeholding, and they were like, yep, love them, sidewalks, great, here's some feedback, and we had one stakeholder meeting with them. And kept them apprised and so forth. Meeting with the single and two family home builders. Home Builder Association was at the table, Associated Building Contractors, everybody who needed to be NAOP, I don't even know what that acronym is, but something related to apartments. So, had all the stakeholders at the table. And so we committed through that process, because this was a big change, a big elevation, a big expansion, that we would kind of come back in a year, garner that feedback, and see if we needed to do another touch on that legislation. What we saw, and I think, the Home Builders Association was engaged. They were generally supportive. They did not oppose the legislation. But I found that there were kind of single and two family home builders that maybe weren't as sort of plugged into the Home Builders Association, right? They aren't on the email list. They weren't the paying members. Nashville was kind of gunning and growing, and there were a whole lot of home builders that I build 4 houses a year or 2 houses a year, and that was really starting to ramp up. Those folks, when they went and pulled permits and found that they had to build sidewalks, they were kind of apoplectic, right? And it's not that we hadn't had, good community engagement, public meetings, and home builders associations, but that constituency started to get pretty oppositional. And I will say one thing that I reflect on from a planning standpoint, Marty, all due respect to Council Lady Roberts, she and I have talked about this, and I know that community in the Nations was really wanting those sidewalks, but the strategic framework that was established for the legislation, where you could not contribute in lieu, where you had to pay the sidewalk or build the sidewalk, that contemplated it being in our urban zoning overlay, which was our historic city of Nashville before our city and county consolidated. So in the majority, that was about 70-ish% sidewalked. And so you didn't have to go very far to see a historic sidewalk pattern, so it kind of made sense to say, you've always got to build it, or you need to seek a waiver. But out in suburbia, and if you were on a neighborhood scaled street, you didn't otherwise have sidewalk infrastructure, you could contribute in lieu and also contribute the right of way, get a waiver, so to speak. But what happened when we expanded into the Nations was, because that had not historically been the UZO, there was, Ms. Alman spoke to it in the infrastructure panel, if you were there, there weren't ditches, there were no stormwater requirements when that area was built. And so, JS, you were alluding to it earlier, kind of the sidewalk to nowhere, that's what we didn't want to do. And so by triggering the requirements in an area like the Nations, that kind of set off a cascade of home builder frustration, Home builders went to the state. State has tried to preempt our sidewalk legislation. There's been litigation about it. In the background, I've been fighting that for years. It's up at the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati right now, so here's hoping our city prevails. So the policy space then, to your question about kind of what's next, I had hoped before I was out of office to touch this legislation one more time to see like, oh, maybe in this context we could require, what could we fix? But all this pending, the pending caption bill every year of the state, are they gonna reach down? Are they gonna, what's the Beacon Center gonna say about it next? All this kind of stuff really has put us in a posture of just letting this sort of settle in. And so when you're doing land use policy, there's a variety of constituents. And so there's single and two family home builders, there's subdivision developers, there's multifamily and commercial developers. And you can only push on those stakeholders and constituencies so much at any one time. And so I would have liked before the end of this term to come back and do some fine tuning. Perhaps we can still do that, but that may need to be the next council. So I think when you pass a big bill like that, JS, like you try to do your best for the whole 526 square miles, and you can't always do everything just right, and you take the feedback and you iteratively try to make it better. So I would say that's a very long answer to what we need to do next on sidewalk policy, but Wesley maybe from a walk bike perspective has an idea on that as well.
Yeah, I think maybe not so much in the weeds of the policy, but again, to a framing point, and I think our walking infrastructure inherently ties into Vision Zero and trying to reduce fatalities. And so what policy mechanisms are we advocating, maybe not council members per se, but Nashvillians advocating for at the state level? I was on a call with some Vision Zero advocates nationally, and Texas has a state Vision Zero plan, right? If we had a state Vision Zero plan, that changes the conversation around walking infrastructure along our state routes, for example. That doesn't solve the suburbia problem, but that is one thing. And I think there's other opportunities with the sprawl as well that intersect with land use planning. So I don't know. I do think the next council, will definitely have to reevaluate the sidewalk plan. But I also want to say too, I remember when I was a senior in high school when the sidewalk legislation was passed, and even when there are quote unquote sidewalks to nowhere, we are now 6 years into this legislation, and in neighborhoods like the Nations that would have benefited greatly if this legislation was passed 5 years ago, there are so many more sidewalks than there were. And I think it's worth saying that and giving credit where credit is due on that, because now if Metro wants to come in and fill a gap, that is a lot easier. I mean, that is incremental development.
Gaps to prioritize.
Yeah. And so I want to name that too. Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that too. And those of you who are on Gallatin Pike and in the Inglewood area, and I guess more closer to just lower East Nashville area, you've seen over time as the new development is coming in, the standard has changed. And it's very obvious what's new and what's old in that regard. And so you see the new standard from the Major Collector Street Plan and from benefiting from this legislation. The other thing that we can do, and we started working on at INDOT, is updating the traffic impact study requirements that developers are required to address. We're in the middle stages of that, and we'll be reaching out to Councilmember Henderson and others here in the very near future with some proposals for them to consider. But the idea of being able to have a better process for determining what that need is. Right now, our traffic studies are very focused on how many trips for cars that you create, and we would like to be able to move more toward a multimodal approach to that and being able to define the need based on that. And there are various ways that we could do that we're considering right now, and so we're looking forward to bringing that out in the next several months to push forward. But that's just one thing. The other is just that, over time, based on the budget that you have for sidewalks, the chart can go up and down, and as consistent as that can become over the years, the better we're going to be at delivering sidewalks on a more timely basis, just because we'll have the capacity, the consultant, the private sector will have maintained that capacity over time. They're not having to start over or lay off, and that kind of process. You want to be able, whatever, sidewalks, roads, anything, the more consistent you can be across the board on that, the better you were able to deliver over time. Is there anything you want to add?
Is there anything any of you know of that other cities from a policy and legislation perspective have done that makes it easier than what we do? I don't know, comparison to Atlanta, perhaps, Marty, not to put you on the spot, or do other cities have different policies in place that therefore lead to different results?
You know, it really is all over the place. In Atlanta, they were very particular about the cross-section, especially in the last 15, 20 years. And then I've also worked in Cobb County, Georgia, where very much more suburban location, where it was not so much that, where it was about the basic, the 5 foot or 6 foot, depending on what type of corridor you were. But it is across the board. And I'll see if, did you want to add anything?
I will add, I mean, the difference primarily between us and other cities, and you could see the distinction in Nashville, is we didn't require them, right? It was a policy failure. And so now we're having to work backwards. I have, when I do have a little bit of time to, go to a conference or speak with legislators from other kind of, sprawled suburban southern cities, I really do think our policy is good. It was groundbreaking. It can always be fine-tuned and improved, and every city is a little bit different. Us being a city-county consolidated government is somewhat different, but we do have other peers in that regard. So I have looked in all the policy that we do. Anybody who serves and has served on city council, I see some folks running for office and former council members, Ms. Lalonde there. We are always looking at peer cities, right? And so if there's a problem that you want to address, you're looking like, oh, what do you do here? What do you do there? But then you realize like how their department works and what their road thing and their land, like every city, like you can try to find those best practices, but you really just have to kind of lean in and figure out how your city works. So, yeah.
Great. Well, like I said at the beginning, I don't want to rehash the infrastructure session from earlier. I'm also not a radio announcer, so it probably won't be as good. But stormwater's come up several times. 70% of the cost of sidewalks is tied to stormwater. I'd like to just give a minute, not to, again, rehash anything, but ties of sidewalks to other kinds of infrastructure. Is it bike paths? How do sidewalks tie to other policy decisions we want to make in the city versus, just the granularity of I want a place to walk? Maybe Wesley, I can kind of mention that a little bit. Who wants to go first?
I can, yeah, sure, because this is how I think. Because being new to the specifics of walk and bike advocacy, I think a lot about urban planning and community development. And the truth, I wasn't in the infrastructure session. It sounds like it was quite intriguing. So maybe I'm not touching exactly on what you're asking, JS. But I think we didn't only, like the policy failure that Councilmember Henderson is talking about doesn't end at our sidewalk policy over the last 60 years, right? Our suburban developments, I grew up in one. It's nothing against them, it's just fact, they don't pay for themselves. They don't, right? And we are, again, it's one thing to retrofit and to work within our existing suburban developments, but the fact that we're continuing to build and then now we're rationalizing that, well, we have an affordable housing crisis, so we should continue to build. That's not the answer, right? We need infill housing, we need density where we already have sidewalks, or we already have high-frequency transit, and then we can work out from there. It's always gonna be hard to build sidewalks at the edge of Davidson County, and it's always gonna be extremely expensive to do so. So I think there's things I'm not an expert on, but I think there's a lot of policy things the city could consider. And also too, like it's not a Nashville problem. It's an everywhere problem. Every city is built like this since World War II, but some cities will have an urban growth boundary, for example, where they say we're not allowing development outside of this boundary. There's ecological concerns, environmental concerns with how we build. And the one other thing, because I mentioned shared use paths, so for folks that aren't aware, those are where you have, instead of a bike lane or a sidewalk, you have a shared path for bicyclists and pedestrians, and those are actually in the in the curb-to-curb boundaries, and that's why I mentioned that those could be less expensive. It's actually on the asphalt versus building the concrete, and I think the great protected bikeway project we have on 12 South is groundbreaking for Nashville. It's not a shared use path, but my point is it opens our imagination to how can we think about our roads differently. So that was a little bit all over the place, but yeah.
And I think too, making sure that, the sidewalk plan, the bikeway plan, the walk and bike strategic plan of 2016-ish, 17, it spoke to neighborways, and so I often mention that to my suburban constituents, really from an infrastructure perspective for connectivity and sprawled land use patterns, to be able to get to that school, to be able to get to those stores. Greenways really are a great solution for that. Greenways have historically in Nashville, as we've tried to build that network, maybe they've been fairly narrow. It's sort of like, okay, kids, let's put the bike on the car and let's drive to the greenway. Nope, we got to connect all these things. And so in a suburban context, neighborways, so traffic calm streets where cars really are the guests, right? So you can utilize the asphalt to bike, to walk, and kind of building those neighborways out from trip generators, the schools, the parks, the access to transit. And so being really intentional about looking back into that adjacent suburban neighborhood. So for you all as taxpayers, right, you want to be safe in your community, you want your kids to be able to bike to their friend's house, you want to be able to walk to the bus or to school. And so, we can kind of pick one street through the middle of that and say, okay, we're going to put a massive capital sidewalk investment down here, or we can traffic calm the whole entire neighborhood, bring the speed limit down to 20, say that this is the neighborway through the middle, and it's very much a culture change, right? Because we're sprawled out and people are behind and they want to kind of blow on through. So I really think when you're as behind as we are, it has to be all the things. And I do think we have to be really intentional about talking to folks about, when you're speeding around, you're the reason that kids can't walk to school. You're the reason that kids can't bike to school. And taking some kind of ownership of that. Often a lot of the constituents that are asking me for the sidewalks and the speeding enforcement, I see them speeding through my neighborhood in a car the size of a tank, okay? And I understand the desire because you feel unsafe and you want to be in that tank to make your kids safe. But the trucks are getting bigger, the SUVs are getting bigger, the fatalities are going up, people are speeding. We have got, as a community and people who advocate for sidewalks and care about walkability, we've got to lean into the speed limits, the design of neighborways, the greenway connectivity, all that stuff, because we're trying to build a useful network, right? So it's not just specifically about capital sidewalk infrastructure. The reason we're all here and why we care about it is we want to build a safe, walkable network, and you don't always have to just do that with capital sidewalk infrastructure.
Especially on the safety side, we can have great sidewalks, but if we don't have safe intersections, then that's a lot of the crashes are near and around the intersections and near and around the transit stops. And again, that's for lots of reasons, but we have to be able to address the intersections as well. And that's one of the focuses of our Vision Zero implementation, is to do that and come up with the best possible ways to do it, whether it's coming from our development review side, getting developers to look at those types of things, not only just to help us with constructing it, but part of what we would do with our traffic impact study update is based on the size of development, and you would have to look out into an area outside of your project and look for safety issues, do an assessment and understand where maybe they can't address them, but then we know what they are, and then we can start prioritizing them. I just wanted to make that point too. It's how important it is. And that's when you're thinking about where you want to advocate for a sidewalk too. You know, what kind of intersections are you taking people through, and what kind of attention do we need to play or to give to that as we're designing the sidewalk? And that's and frankly, that's where they get even more expensive when we start dealing with those things. But you know, we're talking about people's lives here. You know, this is serious business. This isn't so we can go take a stroll, you know, and be healthy. We have people who depend on the sidewalks or the side of the road, whatever it is, as you all know, your neighbors and friends and family, that they need to get to work, they need to take their kids to school, they need to do all these different things that they don't really have a choice, right? Some of us live in places where we can make those choices and have those opportunities, but and that's when we're thinking of this kind of getting ahead a little bit to what we were going to talk about, I believe, but as we're thinking about, you know, communicating to staff, communicating to advocacy, you know, where those sidewalks need to be. It's always important, from my perspective, this is basically what we think in the department, and my personal opinion too, is those people who depend on it, that have to have it, that will be unsafe without it, we need to focus on them first. We need to focus on those locations and get that fixed. And that's a huge piece of the puzzle. And it's also important, you know, for everyone to understand that. We don't have to fight over these resources. We maybe that we need to widen or make the pie larger even, you know, and that's obviously a policy decision that would come from our elected officials as well. So just wanted to add that piece too.
So, last question for me, on that advocacy thing, what can neighbors and neighborhood associations do what's the most effective way for them to advocate for sidewalks in their communities?
I want to make one comment about advocating for sidewalks, and to make sure everybody is keeping this in mind too. Repairs. I live in Old Hickory Village. Like I mentioned, we have some sidewalks that are new and some that are very old, and I trip on them all the time. And you may do the same in your neighborhoods, and that's, I have, you know, as you do too. I have neighbors who have various disabilities, or they have young children, and they're navigating this space. Their concern isn't whenever they stub their toe or on it, you know, or my dog pulls me into the wrong direction. But keep that in mind too as we're talking about sidewalk advocacy, because the way to do that, and we can talk to Bala too about how we respond to those requests, but Hub Nashville, I know that we preach that a lot, but that is the place to go when you see those types of situations for repairs. And I'm going to hand it over to Bala. Can you talk about how you take those requests and how we respond?
You just go through, usually when someone notices a sidewalk needs to be repaired, maybe a tripping hazard, they usually go through Hub Nashville and put in a request, and then that goes through all the channels, and it comes to me, and then I'll kind of get the contractor to do the repairs. But sometimes it might take a couple of weeks to get to that repair because we have a long list of repairs, and it also depends on staff and workload. So, but we usually respond. We take it very seriously as far as tripping hazard and safety. So,
and sometimes those aren't just the cracks. Sometimes that might be a short gap that is out there. That maybe it's like in my neighborhood where the alleys cross. A lot of the locations where the alleys touch the street, we have gaps, and so that's the kind of thing I ought to be putting into Hub Nashville, I suppose, to benefit for myself. But Councilmember, you got it.
I would say from an advocacy standpoint, I think often whether people on a particular street or an individual in a neighborhood is thinking kind of like, oh, I need a sidewalk here. What I would encourage neighborhood leaders and advocates to do, work in partnership with your council member, and again, think about that network, right? Where are neighbors wanting to go? Are they trying to get to transit? Are they trying to get to the closest school? Think about the traffic calming. Think about kind of the neighbor way concept of things. Do we actually need a capital sidewalk here? What would the cost for that be? You can work with your council member to put something into our capital improvements budget. You'll hear people talk about the CIB. It's kind of counterintuitive because that's a planning document. But nothing can be in the capital spending plan, which should be budget, CSP, unless it is first in the CIB. And when something is in the CIB, then the Nashville Department of Transportation has to do an estimate to deliver that project, right? So they look at the stormwater, they look at the right-of-way acquisition, how many linear feet. And so, they may come back to that council member and say, council member, I know that's an important connection, that's gonna be $2 million, right? And so looking at, and I hope we get kind of better at, again, and I'm not suggesting folks aren't working together, but sort of siloing the sidewalks, right? Or the goal is to be safe, to be connected. And so I think a council member can bring that level of intention, like, okay, well, this is the traffic calming piece, and maybe the sidewalk here, but we're trying to get to this greenway. I do feel like that's kind of the challenge for me as a council member. Often I just feel like I'm spinning a lot of plates of trying to put this together with that, and then I got to talk to WeGo. And so your council member is your partner for sure. So from an advocacy perspective, rather than, kind of, we need a sidewalk here, really get in touch with your council member and talk about what you're trying to achieve as a community. We want to be better connected to this grocery store. We want to be better connected to transit. We want our kids to be able to walk to school. And then I think, and I hope in time, whether it's, Safe Routes to School funding or Vision Zero, there's a variety of buckets. And then really it's the council member and NDOT and the community working together, unfortunately, to say kind of like, okay, we're gonna take this from this bucket and this from that bucket to kind of solve that problem or deliver a solution for that neighborhood. A sidewalk that I think is very obviously needed in my own district, in the neighborhood where I used to be president of the neighborhood association. It has massive stormwater implications. It has massive tree loss implications. We're very fortunate. We have a lovely kissing canopy of trees because our power lines are behind houses, which is lovely, and would that we had required that everywhere. So it's a very obvious need. There's transit access, there's a public park, there's a public botanical garden, like everybody, like, why is there not a sidewalk here? But when you get into that granular level of what the implications of that would mean from a stormwater standpoint and from a tree loss standpoint. So we worked with NDOT. When that road was repaved, we did not put back a yellow center line, because good research shows that when you got that yellow center line, people will just zoom. They feel real confident about where they are in the roadway. So we did white edge line. We took out the yellow center line. It's already a very historically narrow road. That was a traffic calming measure. Now people feel more safe walking on that street where, yes, everybody obviously feels like there's a sidewalk, but at least in the meantime. And the difference on that road, JS, from the water department repave that put back the yellow center line before I had read the good research about taking out yellow center line, the speeds that people go on that segment versus the speeds that people go on the segment where we took out the yellow center line, it's really interesting. So I think, there are things that we can do in advocating, but as a council member, I would say, go to your council member, for sure.
Yeah, I think everyone in this room understands this based on your engagement. You're here today, but every time we do a planning process, I know that people get tired of it. You're having to fill out a survey or go to a meeting, but it's really not an excuse, because this is what we do. This is how you build cities, and we're building a city as we go here. And just bear with us. We need your input, and we need people to show up and help us, because this is where we're determining what that prioritization process would look like. These are where those factors are being discussed that you need to make sure your input is helping to guide. Otherwise, we don't know that. That's how we are. Obviously, we're balancing against best practices and the technical assessments and that sort of thing, but the community has a huge role in helping us shape what that prioritization should look like. And so I just encourage you to participate. We hope to be doing more and not less planning studies, so that not just so we can do planning studies, but so we can follow through and implement them and make big changes in our community.
Thanks. Questions?
So this is kind of a question/comment. It was brought up earlier about the shared spaces and the issues with the more suburban county edge and different construction materials. I've, traveling to Brentwood a lot to see my partner's family. When you go down Concord Road, Wilson Pike, some of the major corridors in Brentwood and Wilson County, you see what I think is an ideal kind of suburban, rural, multimodal. Concord Road, for example, it's a wide road with a turn lane, but on both sides, you got curb, about a 2-foot strip of grass, and then like a 5 or 6 foot strip of asphalt that serves as both their sidewalk, their greenway, their bikeway. Is that something we can start looking at as a possible solution for our more rural and suburban parts of Davidson County, that, especially on our major work connectors, instead of focusing on just building a sidewalk, doing something that serves dual purposes like that?
Russ, can you also introduce yourself?
Sorry.
Everyone to introduce themselves, say where they live.
Russ Bradford. I am on the council representing District 13. I live over by Elm Hill Pike.
I want to make sure that Mr. Freeze back there is here. He may need to chime in at some point, but the idea, one of the things to keep in mind, that especially as you're retrofitting and we've waited a while, a lot of our rural cross sections that we would want to do that to, you end up spending the same amount of money because you got to widen it, and that sort of thing. Obviously, those areas in Williamson County have had the opportunity, I guess, of time and of space, to spread out and use the best contour and use the land the way that you want to use it in the best way. They've got that benefit of doing it now versus 50 years ago or 60 years ago, and that they're growing now versus when so much of Nashville proper was the 1970s and late 60s period when nobody was doing sidewalks. Really, we were, one of the misfortunes of when our growth happened is that had it happened in the 40s and 30s, we would have more like Memphis and other places where they do have a larger network of sidewalks, but that's just how it happened to be here. I was just going to hit on that one point though, that sometimes it could be just as expensive, but we do spend a lot of time with our partners in other parts of the region, whether it's through GNRC or just conversations with various professionals, and keep an eye on what they're doing. The paths to go from West Haven to downtown Franklin, for example, that's something that works very well in that particular context. But they still have the similar issues at intersections and making sure that they're prioritizing multimodal in those locations, and limited transit that they have too to serve in those locations. But that's just a couple of things I wanted to point out.
And I think Councilman Bradford in Williamson County, to their benefit or maybe to their detriment, they had, it was kind of farm, and we came in and we did subdivision, and so there was an ability, because we knew we're going to turn all these into subdivisions and happening kind of at a similar time, so they could kind of, set that standard through that corridor. So I know we've looked somewhat at, in our subdivision regs, interestingly, that's where Nashville first got its sidewalk requirements, is internal to subdivisions. First they were on one side of the street and kind of skinny, and then I think they got a little wider, and then they were on both sides of the street, and so that kind of, I don't like to say this because now we passed conservation development, so we retain more trees in our subdivisions, but having that kind of clean slate, clear earth approach to, putting in this walkable infrastructure, whereas we're kind of piecemeal filling it in, it becomes harder to effectuate that, I think. But your point's well made. I mean, as you drive around, it's like, this is all kind of working better, but it all kind of happened at one time out there. So.
I really appreciate the question, Councilmember, and I think it gets to kind of what I was trying to say. So curb to curb, right? When I think mostly about our arterials here in Nashville, Elm Hill Pike being one, Murfreesboro, Dickerson, all of these, right? The character of that road should change as it goes from a dense urban area into the rural areas. It was all these pikes were originally designed, right? To get from Nashville out to Dixon, out to Murfreesboro, right? Out to Gallatin. We curb to curb dedicate 100% of the road to cars. a mile outside of Nashville, 10 miles outside of Nashville, right? So I think there is opportunity to do what you're saying and see something. It might not be exactly like what you see on Concord Road, because we might not have the right of way to put in the same median there, but you know, how does it intersect with if we want to do transit only on these corridors? How does it intersect with that? And I think there's a great strong towns concept that I think is helpful here of, we have stroads in Nashville. They neither are effective streets or effective roads. A road is an interstate, for example, that gets you from point A to point B quickly. We can do that. A street is a Broadway or a Second Avenue that is a wealth generator, that is a place you want to spend time. Yeah, you can drive on it, but you're not going to go 45 miles an hour on it. We have these stroads that try to do both and thus do nothing well. And they're dangerous, they're not enjoyable to be on, they're not good for business. And that's the one point I think I want to make with walkability. Sometimes sidewalks are on the edge of kind of advocacy when it comes to city issues. To me, it is the rare win, 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 win. When you invest in walkability infrastructure, you have less of a burden because that's one less person in the car. Car infrastructure is expensive. It's a justice issue because folks, it is a much lower barrier to walking than any other mode of transportation. Although sometimes, you know, some folks can only use transit, right? But for the most part, it's a wealth issue. It's an economic development issue. We built our cities for 10,000 years around pedestrians, and only in the last 100 we've stopped doing that. And those are that's the major challenge that we have today. It's not easy to fix the last 100 years of development, but yeah, I hope we're doing it somewhat. I'll get off my soapbox.
Additional questions?
We have one more.
So I know I saw you earlier. Do you still have one or no?
Well, I do. I was just wondering if there were, sorry.
The session's being recorded, so want to make sure everyone can hear the question.
Okay. I have a teacher voice, so I'm not afraid. I guess I was looking at this as possibly accessibility issues. I know I live on right off of Old Hickory Boulevard and Central Pike, and I know some guys who have low income and they're trying to walk to Kroger or to the bus. So they walk from Central Pike down a sidewalk, and then there's a nice new sidewalk, it's beautiful. They're walking, and then all of a sudden they're back in the mud, and they're getting to Kroger. And then there's this one particular gentleman who is on his red scooter, and he can get to the sidewalk, and then but he can't get to Kroger. And he has to turn back around. His life is very, very small, where he can go from one place on Central Pike to another place on Central Pike, and then he goes across Old Hickory Boulevard. And that's as far as he can go, unless he's getting on the little bus, but he just can't go get a pizza whenever he wants to. So I'm thinking maybe out there somewhere there's an advocacy of it, opportunity available, or ADA accessible money available, so he can go get himself a pizza when he feels like getting a pizza.
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't talked that much about ADA accessible, and I've seen the same thing on Charlotte Pike near my neighborhood. I have actually walked from my house to Kroger, and there are not sidewalks the whole way.
I mean, I think Mr. Sewell can probably speak to that better than I, but Nashville is under a consent decree as it relates to ADA compliance. And so when we do fix a sidewalk or come back in to pave an area, if that does engage the sidewalk, we have to make it ADA accessible. I will say there are some places that I have looked at in Green Hills and elsewhere for years and years and years and years that even kind of have gotten the fix supposedly, but there's still that utility pole like right there, and like I don't think it's the prescribed 3 foot something. So you know, again, 526 square miles, all these road miles, but I think we do, you know, whether through hub or otherwise, you know, I would like to see us. Obviously, you know, we have to kind of serve the most people, but for those vulnerable populations, I would like to see us being able to, when we know that someone resides in a certain place, and has an accessibility issue, they need to get to transit, they need to get to a grocery store. I mean, those are fundamental, like, you need food, you need transportation. I don't know how Metro kind of engages that from a, I know we have funding specifically for gaps, right? And funding for ADA, so maybe Mr. Sewell can speak to that.
I can speak to what we're doing and what we're in the process of doing. It's called a transition plan for the public right-of-way. And it's a requirement that each city and county has to maintain, and we're currently inventorying the entire network for conditions. We have people here that could get into the details of what that entails, but using various technology to understand where the cracks are, where the grades are wrong, and that sort of thing. And it doesn't mean that we can go out and just fix it all at one time. And part of the law is that we have to identify it. We have to have a long-range plan of addressing it and showing that there's how you're making progress toward it. And so that's one thing that we're doing right now. That inventory is in progress. And not only does that help for just addressing ADA issues, but that helps with just our sidewalks in general and making them safer and better quality. And Bob and his team has been working with that, with our group as well. And so just getting that started in the last few months or so, Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for like one more question. You still have one? He has one? All right, it's you.
After all that, I'm Kerry Rogers from Inglewood. After all this talk, it's about the money, okay? And the fact is that Megan Berry put more money in sidewalks in 2 years, I think, than we've had since then. So where do we get the money? We seem to find money for other things, I won't mention what that is. Where's the money for sidewalks?
So I do want to respond to that. I think when I came into office, if you looked kind of through the Dean administration, you had kind of 12 here and 17 there, and then when Mayor Berry came into office, I think, Kerry, we funded 30 million into sidewalks.
60 million.
Okay, 60 million. What I will point out about that, though, because to Mr. Sewell's point, as far as implementation, so it's not just about the money. Absolutely, we need more money. So coming off the Walk and Bike Strategic Plan for 2 years as Vice Chair of the Public Works Committee, I actually had an annual Walk and Bike Strategic Plan implementation meeting, right? How are we delivering on the plan? And what we saw there is we had pipeline issues, right? So we had funded all this money into it, but we didn't have the appropriate kind of staffing to deliver. And so we had process issues, I would say. And so I concur with you, Kerry. There has got to be, and Marty spoke to that earlier, consistent funding. And we have been at fits and starts. Again, we have had 3 mayors in the time that you would have 1. We have had an NDOT, we went from Public Works migrating to NDOT. We had a director when I came in. A few months later, we had a new director in Mr. Sturdivant. Then we had a new administration, and we had Ms. DeMassimo and Ms. Whitelaw. Then we had Mr. Freeze in interim, and then Diana arrived a little over a year ago. So, for those of us as council members, I keep bringing this up a lot. I keep talking about through lines. It has been very hard to kind of hold the through lines to make sure that budgeted aligns with plan, aligns with process, aligns with staff organization. That is what your committees on council are supposed to be doing from an oversight perspective, and that's been difficult. So NDOT, I think, as conceived conceptually, is good, but we've got to kind of get it staffed and get kind of the wheels turning, and then I think you'll see council having the confidence to put back in to the capital budget 30, 30, 30, 30, or maybe once we see staff and the need and the full inventory and the partnership with consultancy and how we can deliver, maybe it's 50, 50, 60. I don't know what the number is, but I will tell you as a council member, all due respect to all the great people doing good work, I've not had the confidence in just dumping more money into that bucket, because we have had process and kind of performance issues. So there is no one on council who doesn't think that funding sidewalks is a priority and wouldn't happily make sure that capital spending bucket is bigger for sidewalks. But what we have also done from an accountability standpoint is, bikeways and traffic calming used to just be dumped in the paving bucket. There was no accountability, there was no visibility for it. Now we have a traffic calming bucket. Now we have a bikeways bucket. At the bikeway level, the network that we need there, right? And being able to say, like, this is how much this costs per linear foot. This is how much money we have in the bikeways, and holding that accountable, holding the traffic calming. It's, we need to fund more into sidewalks. We need to do better, build more, build faster. But we have been, we've been through a lot as a city, and it's just, we're behind. We're still behind, but it's not for lack of your council members trying, so.
Can I get a big round of applause for our panelists? This was awesome. We got right to the last minute. There's surveys on your table. Please fill those out. This discussion, and return them to Tom in the back. This discussion was exactly what I'd hoped it to be. When you're in a meeting and you're using terms like connector streets, arterials, UZO, zoning, overlays, like you're in the nitty-gritty of policy making, which is how we get things done. So appreciate all of you on the panel for engaging in that way, and also all of you guys in the audience. I have a few takeaways. This 180 days on utilities. If we are the cutting edge of sidewalk legislation, like the new frontier for Nashville, so it's on all of us to come up with the next ideas. Thank you so much, and hope you enjoy lunch.
Thanks, Jay.